So Lord, open our hearts, our minds, enable us to hear your love and your challenge today. Amen. We have been, and we still are, on our life song journey as we reflect on how God is singing through individuals in the Old Testament in particular, and through individuals sitting here amongst us. And I'm sure all of you who were able to be here over the last few weeks have thoroughly enjoyed being touched, challenged by the wonderful testimony of many who have shared. And so we do thank them for that. But in a sense, we're now back to the normal. So you got me this morning and not some more interesting people. We're still thinking about life song, and we are journeying through Samuel. When I last preached, the people had asked for a king, and Samuel had said, God had said through Samuel, okay, but there's trouble, and I'll refer to that a little bit later. And we're going to reflect today on King Saul, and then we're moving on to look at King David from next week over a few weeks. My title today is this: King Saul and the Steinhoff Saga. So that woke a few of you up. It may seem a little strange, but hopefully it tweaked some of your interest. I don't know if you've been following the fascinating Steinhoff Saga over the last 6 or 8 months, but it has certainly consumed much of the corporate side of our life in South Africa. And most of you sitting here in one way or another have lost something as a result of all of that saga. Through some of your pension funds, etc., etc. I'm aware of at least 2 books that have been published in the last 6 months to try and unpack it and make sense of it and explain it to us as best as they can. Some even suggest that the Steinhoff saga is merely the tip of the iceberg. So who knows? The University of Stellenbosch Business School published a series of articles trying to unpack it. And I've been able to read some of those. And the one particular one that I'll refer to this morning had this fascinating title: Inside the Mind of Ex-Steinhoff Boss Marcus Jooste. Here's why you could be just like him. Well, King Saul was just like him. One of the characteristics that King Saul and Jooste shared was what we might call a charismatic personality. And my main argument this morning goes something like this: we need and we celebrate charismatic personalities in our society and in our churches. But we need to ensure that systems of accountability allow them to flourish and channel their energies in ways that benefit us all. Because if unchecked, these kinds of personalities can move quickly towards extremes of pride, arrogance, and narcissism. The article written by the Stellenbosch Business School has this as their kind of working definition. They say, research has shown that for someone to be considered a charismatic leader, a combination of 3 requirements are involved: extraordinary qualities that are inherent in the person in question, a social situation that provides the ideal setting for the rise of such a leader, and a particularly strong emotional bond between the leader and his or her actual or potential followers. And if you allow in your own mind to categorize other leaders who may have been, in your opinion, charismatic personalities, you'll see those 3 things coming through. But the sad thing is that a lot of you sitting here know more about Jooste than you know about King Saul. So let me tell you a little bit about King Saul. King Saul was the first official king of the Israelite nation, appointed by Samuel, and came at the end of Samuel's ministry. Samuel was the last of the prophet judges type, and we looked at some of them from the book of Judges. as they had settled in the promised land, they had come and said to Samuel and to God, "We want a king." Samuel and God had warned them that kings come with associated problems. And some of them I reminded you, or they were reminded of, was that kings create government and a bureaucracy and armies, and they need resources in order to do all this, and so they're going to tax you heavily, and they will tend to enrich themselves in those structures. And the people who work for them end up benefiting from the good things that once were yours, the original gravy train. And the end result, they were warned, is a loss of personal freedom. 3,000 years ago, still true today. But they wanted a king. And you heard in our reading today, that still came through. And Samuel still warned them. And they got their first king. Earlier on, when Samuel first meets Saul and Saul comes onto the scene, he's described in these words. Kish had a son named Saul, as handsome a young man as could be found anywhere in Israel. And he was a head taller than anyone else. We, in fact, get our expression, he's heads and shoulders above the rest, from this particular character, Saul. And it was their way of kind of saying he had a big charismatic personality. But we find Saul was not so keen about the idea, and they find him hiding amongst the supplies. But they still tell him, "You are chosen, and you are anointed for this new role." In the process, Samuel explains the rights and duties of a king. We don't have that record, but it would be nice to see what it is. But we can assume some of the earlier warnings were part of that. Saul starts with great success, which is pretty good when you are starting out as the new king, particularly against the enemy number one of the time, which were the Philistines, the coastal people who had superior technology as well. They had moved fully into the Iron Age and had all those crafts that made them superior technology-wise than the others. The Philistines lived in the coastal area known today as the Gaza Strip, which is still a thorn in the side of Israel. And so for 3,000 years, the problem has been the same and never really gone away. Saul, though, had immediate success against them. And linked to some prophetic behavior he got involved in, he was very soon silencing those people who were not sure that he could deliver. He gathered around him a strong and loyal army, and he went on to a number of other successes in battle, beginning to unify the tribes. He never really got to build kingdom in the full sense of the word, because he was kind of sandwiched between Samuel, a huge and powerful character in his own right, still lingering in his old age, and the up-and-coming King David. David had been a musician in the courts of Saul. He had become famous for his dealing with the Goliath problem, and he had forged strong links with Jonathan, Saul's son, and married Saul's daughter Michal. And so when Samuel starts to challenge Saul, because Saul now had begun to operate in a very narcissistic way, he started to go and wage war, deciding what to do instead of asking God first and instead of consulting with Samuel. And so the divisions grew between them. Samuel then went and announced to Saul that God had withdrawn his blessing. He didn't go on to tell him that he had also secretly anointed David as the successor. This comes to a head in a number of ways, particularly when Saul consults the witch of Endor rather than Samuel or God for advice in situations. Saul becomes a jealous despot, spending the rest of his years pursuing David, using state resources, his loyal followers, and the army to try and kill David. Jonathan and Michal get caught up in this crossfire. Saul's life ends in tragedy. when on the losing side of a battle, he chooses to end his life by running his sword through his chest rather than end up alive in the hands of the enemy. It was also prophesied and came true that, including Jonathan, all Saul's sons died in that battle as well. And the door was opened for David to become the second king. The judgment of the Bible on Saul was that his charismatic personality had climaxed with extreme pride, arrogance, and narcissism. And it saw Saul distancing himself from God and Samuel, who had anointed and appointed him. He was now on his own trajectory, and it was a disastrous one of treacherous jealousy, fits of rage, and a collapse of moral leadership. So if we turn to Josta, and I don't presume to know much about him, so I refer to the experts in the article. They write this: Marcus Josta was not seen as just another entrepreneur. In retail circles, he was called a retail star who was charismatic. He was also frequently hailed as a business genius who might have even been viewed by some as South Africa's top businessman, owing to his extraordinary deal-making talent. To his credit, he led an aggressive international expansion and acquisition drive to build an international giant which was unsurpassed in the history of South African business. With each step that he took, Josta was recognized for his charisma and intelligence and for successfully raising significant amounts of capital and engaging in a dazzling array of equity swaps. Offshore listings and a rising share price created and reinforced Josta's image as a superhuman businessman. So they write. Later in the article exploring this idea of charismatic leadership, they bring us into something that broadens our thinking. They say this: society has benefited from charismatic leaders in a great many spheres. Martin Luther King and Nelson Mandela in politics, Mother Teresa and Desmond Tutu in religion, Albert Einstein and Stephen Hawking in physics, and so forth. The same is true for many business leaders who have built prosperity for millions of people in a legal and an ethical manner. However, they continue, it's important to remain alert to the possible ambiguity and danger of charismatic leaders. For every Mandela, there's also a Hitler, a Verwoerd, and a Mugabe. There's a risk that charismatic leaders will become arrogant and believe that they are so extraordinary that ethics and the law do not apply to them. The Steinhoff debacle is a reminder that charismatic leadership can lure people, sometimes unknowingly, in dangerous directions. And so we could add Saul to that list, who led the Israelite nation into a dangerous civil war. Fortunately for Israel, the new King David would quickly be able to take the leadership reins, preventing their nation from slipping into collapsing into bondage under either the Philistines or one of the other neighboring stronger powers. And we'll look at David over the next few weeks because he's a bigger than life character and has lots of coverage in the Old Testament. In their article, the business school pulls things together by saying this: pride and confidence are not de facto undesirable characteristics. In fact, leaders need a healthy dose of narcissism to be successful, as it affords them the psychological energy that drives leadership. However, dysfunctional narcissistic traits such as entitlement, grandiosity, arrogance, hubris, and self-absorption can seriously impede morality. A lack of restraint makes narcissists susceptible to an egocentric sense of entitlement and being above the laws and scrutiny that apply to others. Their authority becomes perverted. But our modern Christian church is not free from this as well. We have been tarnished by a number of similar leaders. Success in megachurches, worldwide TV and publishing audiences have created an environment for the narcissistic tendency to flourish and to collapse with dramatic falls from grace and dysfunctional behavior shattering reality, leaving us embarrassed, trying to salvage the good news of the gospel. The conclusion to that article goes like this: human morality is fragile, notwithstanding most people's good intentions. Unconscious processes regularly lead individuals to engage in ethically questionable behaviors which are inconsistent with their visible characters and inherent beliefs. Human beings are conflicted, capable of great integrity and kindness, but also prone to envy and temptation. There's no getting away from the fact that everyone embodies a mixture of good and bad. Let's therefore not judge Steinhoff and Jooste from atop a moral pedestal, confident in the belief that this could never happen to us or our organization. Even the most moral of intentions can be undermined by an unconscious counter-will, which then triggers a moral collapse. We cannot ignore the fact that there are potential Steinhoffs and Joostes in every corner of society and in our church communities. So my main argument this morning was to say we need to celebrate the charismatic personalities, but we need to ensure that there are systems of accountability and support that allows them to flourish, but channels their energies and their personalities, limiting the potential for narcissism and dysfunctional extreme forms of pride and arrogance to take over. How do we do that? Well, the Stellenbosch Business School in the article didn't offer too many solutions. But maybe they weren't really going to do that anyway. So what does it mean for us as Christians in our community sitting here today, or for you as business people in your workplaces? What can we say? How can we bring glory to God in all situations, advance God's kingdom, and bring peace and justice for all? Well, I'm not going to launch into a full suggested solution, but I want to hint at something I preached on recently, that the biblical solution was to create the three pillars, the three roles of the king, the prophet, and the priest. For every king, we need the strong traditional values of the priestly role. And we need the challenge of the slap in your face of the prophetic role. And when those are manifest in society, we can have healthy politics, good church governments. We can have responsible corporate board and shareholder meetings. And in loving communities, we can together seek to discern God's will in our midst and get involved with that. And we need to hold those up in whatever their modern forms are. And I think part of the success in our South African story has been that our judiciary has held that priestly role of solid, traditional core, the values being held high. And we've had our fair share of slap-in-your-face prophetic styles. Some of them irritate us profusely. But they do ask the questions and suggest you pay back the money, etc. And they're part of healthy politics, are they not? But what about us? When we seek to discern in community what God is already doing in building God's kingdom, then we can choose to respond and become involved. But when we presume to know and even decide for God what God's will is, we create the potential for narcissism to taint our good deeds. Then we choose to abandon what we heard about in our gospel reading. Jesus' model of servant leadership. Success in the servant leadership model is defined from the perspective of those being served. When we choose, says Jesus, to lord it over others, we may find that we too will hear the words of Jesus, words that he expresses strongly as he concludes his Sermon on the Mount. So I conclude with those as well. Jesus says in Matthew 7:21, "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. Many will say to me on that day, 'Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and drive out demons in your name, and perform many miracles?' Then I will tell them plainly, 'I never knew you. Away from me, you evildoers.'" Amen.